Have you ever wondered what happens in the invisible realm on the night of October 31st? Have you ever questioned why one of the holiest men who ever lived, a saint who could literally see demons with his own eyes, issued desperate warnings about this seemingly innocent celebration that has swept across the world? Dear brothers and sisters, what I'm about to share with you will change forever how you see Halloween. This isn't about religious fanaticism or outdated superstitions. This is about life and death, spiritual life and spiritual death, and it comes from the testimony of a man who carried Christ's wounds in his body for 50 years and fought physical battles with demons that would terrify the bravest warriors. Saint Padre Pio of Pietrelcina didn't just preach about spiritual warfare from books. He lived it. Every single night for decades, demonic forces attacked him so violently that his fellow friars could hear the sounds of furniture being thrown across his cell, could see the physical wounds left on his body, could smell the sulfurous stench that lingered in the air after these supernatural battles. But here's what most people don't know about Padre Pio's extraordinary spiritual vision. He could see exactly what happens in the spiritual dimension when humans engage in practices that open doors to evil forces, and what he witnessed happening to families, to children, to entire communities on Halloween. Nights filled him with such horror that he spent his final years desperately trying to warn Catholics about this growing darkness disguised as harmless fun. You have children in your home. If you value your family's spiritual protection, if you've ever felt that something wasn't quite right about Halloween, but couldn't put your finger on what it was, then what you're about to hear could be the most important message of your life. Think about this for just a moment. When was the last time you felt completely at peace on Halloween night? When did you last see a Halloween celebration that left you feeling spiritually uplifted, closer to God, more connected to heaven? When have you witnessed Halloween traditions that filled your heart with joy, hope, and divine love? The silence that follows these questions isn't accidental. Deep in your spirit, you already know something is wrong. Your God-given spiritual discernment is trying to tell you something that your mind might be resisting because of cultural pressure, social expectations, or simply the desire to let your children have innocent fun like everyone else. But Padre Pio, who possessed supernatural vision that allowed him to see souls, angels, demons, and the spiritual consequences of human actions, is screaming from heaven, "This is not innocent. This is not harmless. This celebration that the world has embraced is a spiritual trap that can destroy the very souls you love most." Today I'm going to share with you 3 terrifying spiritual realities that Saint Padre Pio identified about Halloween. Truths that have been hidden from most Catholics, suppressed by a culture that wants you to believe that dressing children as demons, witches, and monsters is just harmless fun. These aren't theories or opinions. These are documented warnings from a canonized saint who possessed supernatural gifts that allowed him to see what most of us cannot see, to understand what most of us cannot understand, to recognize spiritual dangers that most of us cannot recognize. If you believe that your family's eternal destiny is more important than fitting in with cultural trends, if you trust the spiritual vision of a saint over the opinions of a secular world, write in the comments, "Padre Pio, protect my family from spiritual darkness." Your declaration of faith will help this crucial message reach other families who desperately need this supernatural warning before it's too late. Get ready to discover why Halloween isn't just spiritually dangerous, it's spiritually catastrophic, and why this October 31st might be the most important spiritual decision your family ever makes. Before I reveal these 3 terrifying spiritual realities that Saint Padre Pio identified about Halloween, you need to understand why his warnings carry supernatural authority that no other religious figure in modern history can match. Francesco Forgione wasn't just a holy priest who gave good advice about spiritual matters. He was a man chosen by God to live at the intersection of the visible and invisible worlds, to experience spiritual realities with an intensity and clarity that defied natural explanation. From the age of 5, little Francesco could see his guardian angel as clearly as he could see his own mother. But he could also see demons, not as shadows or impressions or feelings of unease. He could see them as distinctly as you can see the person sitting next to you. Throughout his entire life, this supernatural vision never dimmed, never became unclear, never left him guessing about the spiritual forces operating around him. When Francesco became Padre Pio and received the stigmata on September 20th, 1918, his spiritual vision exploded into dimensions that even he found overwhelming. He could read souls like open books. He could see sins that penitents tried to hide. He could witness the exact moment when guardian angels would step back from people who chose evil. And he could see the terrifying moment when demonic forces would rush in to fill that abandoned space. But perhaps most relevant to our discussion today, Padre Pio could see what happens in the spiritual realm during specific times, dates, and celebrations when the barriers between the natural and supernatural worlds become thinner. And Halloween, he discovered with absolute horror, is the night when these barriers don't just become thin, they virtually disappear. During his 50 years of ministry, Padre Pio observed a disturbing pattern that repeated every October 31st. Families who participated in Halloween traditions, even those who considered themselves devout Catholics, would experience spiritual consequences that lasted far beyond a single night of harmless fun. He documented cases of children who became inexplicably rebellious and aggressive after Halloween celebrations. Families who suddenly found themselves plagued by unexplained conflicts, financial disasters, and health crises in the weeks following their participation in Halloween festivities. Adults who reported feeling spiritually empty or disconnected from God after engaging in what they thought were innocent Halloween activities. Most disturbing of all, Padre Pio could see what others couldn't. During Halloween celebrations, demonic entities would actually attach themselves to participants, especially children, creating spiritual bondages that would influence their behavior, their choices, and their spiritual development for years to come. These aren't costumes children are wearing, Padre Pio told his spiritual director in 1952. These are spiritual uniforms that identify them with the forces of darkness. When a child dresses as a demon, a witch, a monster, or any creature associated with evil, they are making a spiritual declaration. They are announcing to the invisible realm, I choose darkness over light. I choose fear over love. I choose death over life. But Padre Pio's warnings went far beyond costumes. He could see that Halloween celebrations created what he called spiritual vortexes, invisible openings through which demonic forces could enter homes, families, and communities with legal spiritual authority because humans had voluntarily invited them through their participation in darkness celebrating rituals. The most chilling aspect of Padre Pio's Halloween warnings was his observation that most participants had no idea what they were really doing. They think they're just having fun, he said, but they're participating in ancient rituals designed to honor death, darkness, and demonic powers. They're offering their children as tributes to forces that seek their spiritual destruction, and because they do it voluntarily, even God's hands are tied in, protecting them from the consequences of their choices. What made Padre Pio's Halloween warnings even more urgent was his supernatural ability to see the long-term spiritual consequences. He could witness how Halloween participation created spiritual entry points in people's lives that demons would exploit months and even years later. A single night of Halloween celebration, he observed, could create spiritual vulnerabilities that would affect a person's relationship with God, their family relationships, their emotional stability, and their spiritual discernment for decades. In his private correspondence with Bishop Karol Wojtyła, who would later become Pope John Paul II, Padre Pio wrote, "This celebration that the world calls Halloween is nothing less than a recruiting event for the kingdom of darkness. Demons use this night to identify and claim those who, through their participation, demonstrate their willingness to embrace evil as entertainment." Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, as Halloween became increasingly popular in Italy and other traditionally Catholic countries, Padre Pio became more and more urgent in his warnings. He could see that this wasn't just an American cultural trend, it was a coordinated spiritual attack designed to infiltrate Catholic families and communities, with darkness disguised as harmless tradition. The saint who had battled demons physically for 5 decades, who bore the wounds of Christ in his body, who possessed supernatural vision that allowed him to see the spiritual realm with perfect clarity, spent his final years desperately trying to warn Catholics about a danger that most couldn't see coming, until it was too late. Today, as Halloween has become a global celebration embraced even by many Catholics, Padre Pio's warnings echo from heaven with prophetic urgency. The 3 spiritual realities he identified about Halloween aren't just relevant for his time. They're more crucial now than ever, as the spiritual darkness he warned about has spread to virtually every corner of the world. The first terrifying spiritual reality that St. Padre Pio identified about Halloween is what he called voluntary spiritual bondage through ritualistic participation in darkness celebration. Padre Pio understood something that most modern Catholics have forgotten. Spiritual forces operate according to specific laws and principles that God established at the creation of the world. One of the most fundamental of these laws is the principle of voluntary invitation. Demonic forces cannot enter a person's life, home, or family without some form of invitation or permission from human beings who possess free will. Demons, Padre Pio explained to his spiritual children, are legalistic creatures. They operate like spiritual lawyers who need legal grounds to establish their presence in human lives. They cannot simply invade wherever they choose. They need authorization, invitation, or some form of voluntary cooperation from the humans they seek to influence. Halloween, Padre Pio discovered through his supernatural vision, provides demons with exactly the legal spiritual authority they need to enter lives, homes, and families, but not in the way most people imagine. The spiritual danger of Halloween isn't primarily about devil worship or occult rituals performed by committed Satanists. The danger lies in the seemingly innocent participation of ordinary families who have no idea that they're engaging in spiritual practices that grant demonic forces legal access to their lives. When parents dress their children as demons, witches, monsters, or any creatures associated with evil, they are making what Padre Pio called spiritual declarations. They are announcing to the invisible realm, whether they realize it or not, that their family chooses to identify with darkness rather than light. When families participate in Halloween, traditions that celebrate death, fear, horror, and supernatural evil, they are engaging in what spiritual warfare experts recognize as ritual participation in darkness. Celebration. These aren't harmless games, they're spiritual activities that carry supernatural consequences whether participants understand them or not. Padre Pio documented numerous cases of families who experienced dramatic spiritual consequences after Halloween participation. The patterns he observed were so consistent that he began keeping detailed records to warn other Catholics about what he was witnessing. Particularly disturbing case involved the Benedetti family from San Giovanni Rotondo in 1958. This devoutly Catholic family, daily Mass attendees who prayed the Rosary together every evening, decided to let their 3 children participate in Halloween for the first time after moving to a neighborhood where the celebration had become popular among American military families stationed nearby. The parents, Giuseppe and Maria Benedetti, saw no harm in allowing their children to dress in costumes and go door to door collecting candy. The costumes seemed innocent enough. Their daughter dressed as a pretty witch, their younger son as a friendly ghost, and their oldest boy as a vampire, all purchased from what the parents considered respectable stores. Within a week of Halloween, the Benedetti family began experiencing unexplained phenomena that would continue for months. Their daughter, previously obedient and spiritually sensitive, became defiant and began expressing hatred for religious activities. Their youngest son developed severe nightmares and began talking to invisible friends who, according to his descriptions, encouraged him to disobey his parents and engage in destructive behavior. Most disturbing, their oldest son began exhibiting what can only be described as supernatural knowledge. He would know things about neighbors and family members that he had no natural way of knowing, and he began predicting future events with unsettling accuracy. But this supernatural knowledge was always negative. He would predict accidents, family conflicts, and personal tragedies that would later occur exactly as he described. When the desperate parents brought their children to Padre Pio, his supernatural vision immediately identified the spiritual source of their family's chaos. "You invited them in," he told Giuseppe and Maria with profound sadness. "Through your children's Halloween participation, you gave demonic forces legal permission to establish residence in your home." Padre Pio explained that when the children wore costumes representing evil entities, they created what he called spiritual agreements with the forces those entities represented. The pretty witch costume connected their daughter to spirits of rebellion and rejection of divine authority. The friendly ghost costume opened their younger son to spirits of death and supernatural communication with evil entities. The vampire costume bound their oldest son to spirits that feed on life force and possess supernatural knowledge gained through demonic sources. These weren't just costumes, Padre Pio emphasized. These were spiritual uniforms that identified your children with specific categories of demons. By dressing your children in these uniforms and sending them out to participate in rituals honoring darkness, you unknowingly signed spiritual contracts that gave those demons legal authority to influence your children's minds, emotions, and spiritual development. The resolution of the Benedetti family crisis required months of intensive spiritual warfare. Padre Pio had to perform multiple exorcism prayers, bless their home repeatedly, and institute a rigorous program of daily spiritual exercises to break the demonic strongholds that Halloween participation had established in their lives. This is what happens, Padre Pio warned other families. When Catholics participate in celebrations designed to honor evil forces, you cannot serve both Christ and Belial. You cannot celebrate light and darkness simultaneously. When you choose to participate in Halloween, you are making a spiritual choice, whether you realize it or not, to align your family with the kingdom of darkness rather than the kingdom of light. But the voluntary spiritual bondage created by Halloween participation extends far beyond individual families. Padre Pio could see that entire communities that embraced Halloween celebrations created what he called territorial spiritual strongholds on geographic areas where demonic forces gained increased authority to operate through the collective invitation extended by multiple families participating in darkness celebration. He documented cases of neighborhoods where Halloween had become a community-wide celebration experiencing dramatic increases in crime rates, family breakdowns, mental health crises, and spiritual apostasy in the months following October 31st. These weren't coincidences, they were direct, spiritual consequences of communities that had voluntarily opened themselves to demonic influence through ritualistic participation in darkness celebration. When an entire community chooses to celebrate Halloween, Padre Pio observed, they create a spiritual atmosphere that invites demonic forces to establish territorial control. The evil spirits that gain authority on Halloween night don't simply disappear on November 1st. They remain active in that community throughout the year, influencing decisions, relationships, and spiritual development until the following Halloween provides them with renewed authorization. 32. Second terrifying spiritual reality that St. Padre Pio identified about Halloween is systematic desensitization to evil that destroys spiritual discernment. Through his supernatural vision, Padre Pio could observe how Halloween participation creates progressive spiritual blindness that makes people increasingly unable to recognize evil when they encounter it in other areas of their lives. This isn't a process that happens overnight. It's a gradual destruction of spiritual discernment that occurs through repeated exposure to evil disguised as entertainment. The most dangerous aspect of Halloween, Padre Pio told his brother friars, isn't the obvious evils that mature Catholics can easily identify and reject. The greatest danger lies in how Halloween systematically trains minds and hearts to find evil entertaining, attractive, and harmless. Padre Pio understood that God has placed within every human soul what Scripture calls the light of conscience, an internal spiritual discernment system designed to recognize good and evil, to be attracted to what is holy and repelled by what is demonic. This spiritual discernment is particularly acute in children, who possess natural innocence that makes them highly sensitive to spiritual realities. Halloween, Padre Pio observed, functions like a spiritual anesthesia that gradually numbs this God-given discernment system. When families participate in Halloween celebrations, they systematically train their minds and hearts to find entertainment value in images, symbols, and activities that should naturally repel anyone connected to the light of Christ. The process begins with seemingly innocent decisions. This little witch costume is so cute. That demon mask is really impressive. These horror movie decorations are so creative. This haunted house experience is thrillingly scary. Each of these statements represents what Padre Pio called spiritual compromise, moments when people choose to find attraction in representations of evil. Through his supernatural vision, Padre Pio could see how each compromise creates what he termed spiritual scar tissue, areas of the soul where natural sensitivity to evil becomes hardened and unresponsive. Like physical scar tissue that lacks normal sensation, spiritual scar tissue cannot properly discern between good and evil. When people participate in Halloween year after year, Padre Pio documented, I can see their spiritual discernment becoming progressively dulled. What should horrify them begins to amuse them. What should repel them begins to attract them. What should concern them begins to seem harmless. This systematic desensitization to evil has consequences that extend far beyond Halloween night. Padre Pio observed that families who regularly participated in Halloween celebrations showed decreased sensitivity to evil influences in other areas of their lives throughout the year. Children from Halloween celebrating families, he noticed, were more likely to be attracted to violent video games, horror movies, and music with dark themes. They showed less natural revulsion toward depictions of death, violence, and supernatural evil. Most concerning, they demonstrated decreased sensitivity to the presence of the Holy Spirit during Mass, prayer, and other sacred activities. Adults from Halloween celebrating families, Padre Pio observed, showed progressive decline in their ability to recognize evil influences in their entertainment choices. relationship decisions, and moral judgments. They became increasingly tolerant of behaviors, attitudes, and cultural trends that clearly contradicted Catholic teaching. Halloween creates what I can only describe as spiritual colorblindness, Padre Pio explained. Just as physical colorblindness makes it impossible to distinguish between certain colors that appear identical to the impaired eye, spiritual colorblindness makes it impossible to distinguish between good and evil that appear identical to the impaired soul. One of the most disturbing cases, Padre Pio documented, involved the Rossi family from Naples in 1963. This family had been participating in Halloween celebrations for 5 consecutive years, considering it harmless cultural fun that helped their children fit in with their American neighbors. During this 5-year period, Padre Pio tracked the progressive deterioration of the family's spiritual discernment. In their first year of Halloween participation, the parents expressed some unease about certain aspects of the celebration, but dismissed their concerns as religious scrupulosity. By the 3rd year, they not only felt comfortable with Halloween, but began decorating their home with increasingly elaborate death-themed displays. By the 5th year, they were hosting Halloween parties that featured entertainment and activities they would have found shocking and morally unacceptable just 5 years earlier. When Padre Pio met with the Rossi parents,
he asked them to recall their first reaction to Halloween when it was initially suggested by their neighbors.
Both parents immediately remembered feeling that something wasn't right about the celebration, that it conflicted with their Catholic values and their desire to raise their children in an atmosphere of light rather than darkness. That initial spiritual discernment was the Holy Spirit speaking to your hearts, Padre Pio explained. But by choosing to ignore those warnings year after year, you systematically destroyed your ability to hear the Spirit's voice. Now what once horrified you seems normal. What once concerned you seems harmless. Your spiritual discernment has been systematically destroyed through repeated participation in celebrations designed to normalize evil. But the spiritual consequences of this destroyed discernment extended far beyond Halloween. During the 5 years of their Halloween participation, the Rossi family had also gradually embraced other activities and attitudes that contradicted their Catholic faith. They stopped attending daily Mass, began skipping Sunday obligations when convenient, allowed their children to consume entertainment with increasingly violent and sexual content, and began making moral decisions based on social acceptance rather than Catholic teaching. This is the ultimate purpose of Halloween, Padre Pio revealed through his supernatural insight. It's not primarily designed to recruit people into obvious devil worship. It's designed to systematically destroy the spiritual discernment that protects Catholics from gradually embracing evil in all areas of their lives. Padre Pio could see that Halloween functions as what modern psychological warfare experts would recognize as systematic desensitization, a process of gradually reducing emotional or moral response to disturbing stimuli through repeated exposure in controlled, seemingly safe environments. The demons who designed Halloween understood human psychology perfectly, Padre Pio observed. They know that people won't suddenly embrace obvious evil, but they will gradually accept increasingly evil things if the process happens slowly enough, and if the evil is presented as harmless entertainment. Through his supernatural vision, Padre Pio could see that Halloween serves as a spiritual gateway drug, an introduction to finding entertainment value in evil that prepares people to accept increasingly serious forms of spiritual darkness throughout their lives. The systematic destruction of spiritual discernment through Halloween participation, Padre Pio warned, creates what he called spiritually defenseless families. Catholics who retain their religious identity and practices but have lost their ability to recognize and resist evil influences in their daily lives. The third and most terrifying spiritual reality that Saint Padre Pio identified about Halloween is generational spiritual contamination that creates hereditary bondage to demonic forces. Through his extraordinary supernatural vision, Padre Pio could see how Halloween participation doesn't just affect the immediate participants. It creates spiritual contamination that passes from generation to generation, establishing what he called hereditary spiritual strongholds that bind families to demonic influences across multiple generations. When families participate in Halloween celebrations, Padre Pio explained with deep concern, they don't just open spiritual doors for themselves. They open doors that their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren will inherit. The spiritual consequences of Halloween participation become part of the family's spiritual legacy. This concept of generational spiritual consequences isn't unique to Padre Pio's teachings. It's clearly established in Scripture. Exodus 25 warns that the iniquities of parents are visited upon children to the third and fourth generation. But Padre Pio's supernatural vision allowed him to see exactly how this biblical principle operates in relation to Halloween participation. He could observe that children born into families with histories of Halloween participation inherited what he called pre-existing spiritual vulnerabilities, areas of weakness where demonic forces had already established legal grounds for influence through their parents' previous Halloween activities. These children, Padre Pio noticed, showed distinctive patterns that differed markedly from children born into families that had never participated in Halloween celebrations. They were more likely to be attracted to dark, frightening, or violent entertainment. They showed less natural affinity for prayer, sacred music, and religious activities. They demonstrated increased rebelliousness toward parental and religious authority. Most concerning, they seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to find and engage with evil influences in their environment. It's as if Halloween participation creates a spiritual scent that marks families for generations, Padre Pio observed. Demonic forces can identify and target these families because of spiritual signatures left by their ancestors, participation in darkness celebration. One of the most disturbing cases Padre Pio documented involved the Marchetti family lineage, which he tracked across 4 generations from 1890 to 1960. The family's Halloween participation began when the first-generation patriarch, Antonio Marchetti, immigrated to America in 1889 and began allowing his children to participate in local Halloween celebrations to help them integrate into American culture. Through his supernatural vision, Padre Pio could see how this decision created spiritual consequences that manifested in each subsequent generation with increasing intensity and severity. The second generation, Antonio's children, showed increased attraction to occult practices and decreased commitment to Catholic faith. 3 of his 5 children eventually abandoned Catholicism entirely, drawn to spiritualist movements and esoteric philosophies that promised supernatural knowledge and power. The third generation, Antonio's grandchildren, demonstrated even more severe spiritual problems. Several became involved in explicit occult activities including seances, tarot card reading, and communication with spirits. Others developed what can only be described as supernatural abilities. They could predict future events, know things about strangers they had never met, and influence other people's behavior through means that defied natural explanation. The fourth generation, Antonio's great-grandchildren, born in the 1940s and 1950s, displayed the most disturbing spiritual characteristics. Several were born with what appeared to be supernatural knowledge of evil practices they had never been taught. Others demonstrated from early childhood an almost magnetic attraction to anything associated with death, darkness, and supernatural evil. When members of the fourth generation were brought to Padre Pio as children, his supernatural vision immediately identified the spiritual source of their problems. These children, he explained to their horrified parents, are inheriting the spiritual consequences of their great-grandfather's decision to allow his family to participate in Halloween celebrations 70 years ago. Each generation's continued participation has strengthened and deepened the spiritual bondage that began with that first compromise. But the generational spiritual contamination created by Halloween participation extends beyond individual family lines. Padre Pio could see that entire communities and cultures that embrace Halloween create what he called territorial generational strongholds. Geographical areas where demonic forces gain hereditary rights to influence multiple generations of families. He observed that regions where Halloween had been celebrated for multiple decades showed progressive spiritual deterioration that manifested in increased rates of mental illness, family breakdown, violent crime, and apostasy from Christian faith. These weren't merely social problems. They were spiritual consequences of communities that had systematically invited demonic influences through generational Halloween participation. When I look at America through supernatural vision, Padre Pio told visiting American priests in 1965, I can see spiritual darkness covering vast areas where Halloween has been celebrated for generations. These regions are marked by territorial demonic strongholds that influence politics, education, entertainment, and even religious institutions. The spiritual contamination created by decades of Halloween celebration has created a cultural atmosphere where evil is increasingly normalized and good is increasingly marginalized. Perhaps most disturbing, Padre Pio could see that the generational spiritual contamination created by Halloween participation makes each successive generation more susceptible to demonic influence and less capable of spiritual resistance. Children born into families with multi-generational Halloween histories often inherit what he called spiritual immunity deficiencies. They lack the natural spiritual defenses that should protect them from demonic attack. It's like a spiritual form of inherited disease, Padre Pio explained. Just as parents can pass physical genetic disorders to their children, Halloween participating parents pass spiritual genetic disorders that make their children more vulnerable to demonic influence and less capable of maintaining strong relationships with God. The solution to generational spiritual contamination, Padre Pio taught, requires what he called generational spiritual housecleaning, a process of identifying and breaking spiritual strongholds that may have been established through previous generations. Halloween participation. This process involves several crucial steps. First, parents must research their family history to identify any ancestors who participated in Halloween or other darkness-celebrating activities. Second, they must make formal renunciation prayers that specifically reject any spiritual agreements or invitations their family line may have extended to demonic forces. Third, they must engage in intensive spiritual warfare prayer to break any hereditary bondages that may be affecting their children. Finally, they must establish new spiritual traditions that actively invite God's protection and blessing over their family line. Breaking generational spiritual contamination isn't easy, Padre Pio warned, but it's absolutely necessary. If parents want to give their children the spiritual freedom that God intended them to inherit. Now that you understand the three terrifying spiritual realities that Saint Padre Pio identified about Halloween: voluntary spiritual bondage through ritualistic participation in darkness celebration, systematic desensitization to evil that destroys spiritual discernment, and generational spiritual contamination that creates hereditary bondage to demonic forces. You need to know exactly what to do instead. Padre Pio didn't just warn Catholics about spiritual dangers without providing positive alternatives. He understood that human beings, especially children, need celebrations, traditions, and activities that bring joy, excitement, and community connection. The solution isn't to create a void where Halloween used to be. The solution is to fill that space with celebrations that honor light instead of darkness, that strengthen spiritual discernment instead of destroying it, and that create generational blessings instead of generational bondages. The most powerful alternative that Padre Pio recommended for October 31st is what he called All Saints' Eve celebration, a family tradition that prepares hearts and minds for the great feast of All Saints on November 1st by celebrating the victory of light over darkness that the saints represent. Instead of celebrating death and evil on October 31st, Padre Pio taught, Catholic families should celebrate the saints who conquered death and evil through their union with Christ. Instead of teaching children to find entertainment in darkness, we should teach them to find inspiration in the light of holiness. Here's how Padre Pio recommended Catholic families celebrate All Saints' Eve saint costume celebration. Instead of dressing children as demons, witches, or monsters, families should help children choose favorite saints and create costumes that honor these holy heroes. Children can learn about their chosen saint's life, virtues, and miraculous works. Then share these stories with neighbors and friends when they visit homes. Holy treats. Distribution. Instead of collecting random candy from strangers, families should prepare special treats blessed by their parish priest and share them with neighbors, along with cards that include prayers, saint stories, or scriptural verses. This transforms the door-to-door tradition into an evangelization opportunity. Saint Stories Evening. Families should gather together for special meals followed by dramatic readings or reenactments of saint stories that demonstrate the victory of good over evil. These can include stories of saints who overcame demonic attacks, converted from lives of sin, or performed miracles that protected communities from spiritual darkness. Protective blessing ceremonies. October 31st should include special family prayers asking for the intercession of all saints to protect the home, family, and community from any evil influences that might be particularly active on Halloween night. Padre Pio provided specific prayers for this purpose. Community light celebrations. Instead of participating in Halloween parties that celebrate darkness, Catholic families should organize community celebrations that focus on light. Activities like bonfire prayers, candlelight processions, or outdoor rosary rallies that visibly demonstrate the community's choice to honor Christ rather than darkness. But Padre Pio emphasized that simply changing external activities isn't sufficient. If families don't understand the spiritual significance of their choices, he insisted that parents must educate their children about why the family chooses not to participate in Halloween, and why they choose to celebrate All Saints' Eve instead. Children need to understand that this isn't about being different just to be difficult, Padre Pio explained. They need to understand that we make these choices because we love them too much to expose them to spiritual dangers, and because we want to give them spiritual advantages that will bless their lives forever. Padre Pio also recommended that families use October 31st as an annual opportunity for what he called spiritual house cleaning, a time to identify and remove any objects, entertainments, or influences in their homes that might provide demonic forces with legal grounds for establishing spiritual strongholds. This includes removing or destroying any items associated with Halloween celebrations from previous years, any entertainment media that glorifies violence or supernatural evil, any games or toys that feature demonic imagery, and any decorative items that represent death, darkness, or spiritual evil. Every object in a Catholic home, Padre Pio taught, either invites God's presence or provides demons with legal authority to establish strongholds. October 31st should be the day when families make conscious choices about which spiritual forces they want to authorize in their living spaces. For families dealing with the spiritual consequences of previous Halloween participation, Padre Pio provided specific prayers and practices for breaking demonic strongholds and establishing divine protection. These include formal renunciation prayers that specifically reject any spiritual agreements created through Halloween participation, blessing prayers that reconsecrate homes and families to God's protection, and ongoing spiritual warfare practices that maintain spiritual victory over forces of darkness. Most importantly, Padre Pio emphasized that choosing to reject Halloween and embrace All Saints' Eve celebration is ultimately about choosing to align with God's kingdom rather than Satan's kingdom. Every choice we make, he taught, either strengthens our connection to heaven or our bondage to hell. There is no neutral ground in spiritual warfare. The decision about how to spend October 31st, therefore, isn't just about cultural traditions or family entertainment. It's about the eternal destiny of souls. It's about whether Catholic families will choose to cooperate with God's plan for their spiritual development or unknowingly participate in Satan's strategy for their spiritual destruction. On this October 31st, you have a choice that will echo through eternity. You can continue participating in Halloween celebrations that Padre Pio identified as spiritually catastrophic, or you can begin new family traditions that honor the saints and strengthen your family's connection to heaven. The choice seems obvious when you understand the eternal consequences, but making this choice requires courage. The courage to be different from a culture that has embraced spiritual darkness as entertainment. The courage to explain to children why your family makes different choices than other families. The courage to trust the supernatural wisdom of a canonized saint over the opinions of a secular world. Saint Padre Pio, who battled demons physically for 50 years and saw the spiritual realm with perfect clarity, is calling to you from heaven. Choose light over darkness. Choose blessing over bondage. Choose the saints over the demons. Choose eternal life over eternal death. Your family's spiritual future depends on the choice you make this October 31st. Will you heed the warnings of a saint who possessed supernatural vision, or will you continue participating in celebrations that he identified as spiritually catastrophic? The demons are counting on you to ignore these warnings. They're betting that cultural pressure, social expectations, and the desire to give your children normal experiences will overcome your spiritual discernment. They're hoping that you'll dismiss the testimony of a canonized saint as religious extremism, so they can continue using Halloween to establish spiritual strongholds in your family. But the saints are praying that you'll choose differently. They're interceding for you to have the courage to break free from spiritual traditions that bind families to darkness, and to embrace celebrations that connect families to light. The choice is yours. But remember, this choice will affect not just you, but your children, your grandchildren, and generations yet to be born. The spiritual decisions you make this October 31st will become part of your family's spiritual legacy that your descendants will inherit. If this message has opened your eyes to the spiritual dangers of Halloween and strengthened your resolve to choose All Saints' Eve celebration instead, write in the comments, Padre Pio, guide my family to choose light over darkness. Your declaration of faith will help this crucial message reach other families who need these supernatural warnings before they make spiritual choices they'll regret forever. Share this message with every Catholic family you know. Like this video if it has given you spiritual discernment about Halloween that you never had before. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss supernatural teachings that can protect your family's spiritual welfare. Consider becoming a member of our community of families who have chosen to honor the saints instead of celebrating demons. Together we're building a movement of Catholic families who refuse to compromise with darkness and who are committed to passing on blessings rather than bondages to the next generation. May Saint Padre Pio intercede for you to have supernatural courage to choose God's kingdom over Satan's kingdom this October 31st. May all the saints surround your family with protection, blessing, and the light of Christ that drives away all darkness. May heaven be with you always. Amen.